Friends, Romans, countrymen, welcome one and all to this year's Parks King Lecture. Our Dean, Greg Sterling, regrets that he can't be with us tonight, so he asked me, his predecessor, to fill in a little bit, and I do so as chair of the Bicentennial Planning Committee. And this event is part of the bicentennial celebration. Yale Divinity School has been here for 200 years doing the great errand, as we've called it, and that errand continues. One of the things that we tried to do this semester was to build into the lectures that we ordinarily have some of the thematics of the bicentennial celebration. That is, looking back over these last 200 years and also looking forward. And it's with that thought in mind that we put together this panel it's going to be introduced by Willie Jennings, who will moderate the conversation. I look very much forward to it and to celebrating the bicentennial with this excellent group of participants. Thank you all for being here. Willie.
Thank you, Harry, and good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I'm Dr. Willie James Jennings. I teach theology and Africana studies here at Yale Divinity School, and it is my honor to echo Harry's words of welcome to you to this exciting panel discussion with three very distinguished alum scholars of Yale University Divinity School. This represents an unprecedented and beautiful modulation of the annual Parks King Lecture. And we are thrilled that these three stellar scholars and teachers have agreed to be here this evening. My friends, the title of this evening's panel discussion is From Where We Stand. Envisioning the future of Black theology. And I can think of no more insightful Black intellectuals to discuss that than Dr. Carrie Day, class of '04, Dr. Elisha Lola Jones, class of '07, and Dr. Jeremy L. Williams, class of '16. Please allow me to take a moment to more fully introduce our stunning panel. Dr. Carrie Day is Associate Professor of Constructive Theology and African American Religion at Princeton Theological Seminary. After graduating from YDS, she earned a PhD in religion from Vanderbilt University. Dr. Day is well known and rightly celebrated for her research in womanist and feminist theologies, social ethics, critical theory, cultural studies, economics, and Afro-Pentecostalism. Dr. Day is the author of several important books, beginning with her 2012 text, Unfinished Business, Black Women, the Black Church, and the Struggle to Thrive in America. Then we were blessed with her 2015 book, Religious Resistance to Neoliberalism, Womanist and Black Feminist Perspectives. She published in 1921 the rightly lauded book, Notes of a Native Daughter, Testifying in Theological Education, which was the subject here at Yale of the YDS All-School Read in 2021. And last year, 2022, she published the groundbreaking book, Azusa Reimagined, a radical vision of religious and democratic belonging, which, as one reviewer stated, this book will redirect moral philosophy and political theology for generations.
That's him.
Well, the truth is the truth no matter where it comes from. My friends, Dr. Day is one of the most important theological voices in the academy today, and it is a great joy to welcome her back to Yale Divinity School. So would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Carrie Day. Dr. Elisha Lola Jones is Associate Professor in the Faculty of Music at the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. After completing her degree at YDS, Dr. Jones earned her PhD from the University of Chicago. Dr. Jones is the author of the multi-award-winning book, Flaming, The Peculiar Theopolitics of Fire and Desire in Black Male Gospel Performance. This groundbreaking book, which analyzes the role of gospel music making in constructing and renegotiating gender identity among Black men, won the Ruth Stone Prize of the Society of Ethnomusicology. It also won the Music in American Culture Prize, and it won the Philip Brett Prize, both from the American Musicological Society. Dr. Jones is completing two very exciting books, Ultrasonic Tastemakers, Towards a Critical Gastromusicology, and the book, Sound Our Signatures, A Womanist Approach to Music Research, which sets forth anti-oppressive ways of listening to Black women. Dr. Jones is also a celebrated performer scholar who consults with museums, conservatories, seminaries, and art organizations on curriculum, live and virtual event programming, and content development. She is the album note researcher and writer for the 2022 Grammy-nominated Requiem for the Enslaved by Carlos Simon. And she regularly supports multiple orchestras through her research, including the London Symphony Orchestra, the Aspen Festival, and the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, to name just a few. This year, my friends, on International Women's Day, Dr. Jones will be awarded the 2023 Power of Women Award for Excellence as an educator at NBC Universal in London. That deserves applause. The Reverend Dr. Jones is a fourth-generation ordained preacher on both sides of her family in the Word of Faith and Pentecostal traditions. A little-known fact is that Dr. Alicia Lola Jones and her sister, Reverend Angela Marie Jones, are co-owners of Paradise Media Group, a Black, women-owned radio company with stations based in Oxford and Henderson, North Carolina. Shout out to North Carolina. Reverend Dr. Jones is bicontinental, residing in Knoxville, Tennessee, and Cambridge, England, with her life partner in ministry and love, Reverend Calvin Taylor Skinner, who I believe is here today, isn't he? Yeah, so wave so everybody, please stand up so everybody can see. Now that's a supportive brother right there. Friends, it is a joy to welcome back to Yale Divinity School Dr. Alicia Lola Jones. Please join me in welcoming her. Our third distinguished panelist is Dr. Jeremy L. Williams. He is Assistant Professor of New Testament at Bright Divinity School at Texas Christian University. Dr. Williams is a top-tier scholar of religion and biblical scholar who specializes in New Testament and early Christianity. After graduating from YDS with his MDiv, Dr. Williams earned his PhD at Harvard University in a very timely fashion. His groundbreaking research brings matters of criminology and race to the interpretation of biblical texts. His current scholarly focus is on the Book of Acts and a detailed and powerful analysis of the ways imperial and local officials criminalize the Jesus-following movement. His academic publications include I Am a Human, Racializing Assemblages and Criminalized Egyptianness, and Acts 21:31 through 39, published in what is now recognized as one of the most important books in African American biblical interpretation today. Bitter, the Chastening Rod, Africana Biblical Interpretation After Stony, the Road We Trod, in the age of hashtag BLM, hashtag Say Her Name, and hashtag Me Too. Dr. Williams' first book, we are very excited about this, will soon be released this fall by Cambridge University Press, entitled Criminalization in Acts of the Apostles, Race, Rhetoric, and the Persecution of an Early Christian Movement. Dr. Williams is also an ordained minister in the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. And we are so glad to have the Reverend with us tonight. My friends, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeremy L. Williams. My friends, this evening, our way of proceeding will be for me to offer a couple of questions and then simply stand out the way and listen to Black Genius. So I begin with this first question for the panelists. I'm ask them to take just a few minutes to situate us in their thinking on these matters. What has been one of the most enduring contributions of Black theology to the church and the academy from the perspective of your work and your life? So I'll begin with my dear doctor closest to me, and we'll work our way across the table.
Well, first, I have to say thank you, and what a treat it is to engage you, Reverend Dr. Jennings, largely because my theological journey started with some conversations with you in another corridor of the United States, and I'm so happy that you are now affiliated with home. So thank you so much for welcoming us this evening. When I think of the Parks King Lecture, I always think of Dr. Yolanda Smith. And
Yes.
and her intervention bringing a very important folk text into the academy, that of the Negro spiritual. Negro being a way of referring to period, right? Distinguishing it from Appalachia. But also giving us a sense of the politics at work, the ways in which even our elders still refer to themselves as Negro, all right? But through Dr. Smith, it was refreshing to have brought into the classroom a way of thinking about text that was culturally relevant. And that conceptualization of text is consistent with our storytelling traditions as African Americans, right? The griot tradition. I believe Thomas Hale would tell us that there are at least 22 features of a griot, and they manifest in our religious life through the preacher, the witness, the commentator, the warrior, the person who is the praise singer, accompanied with instrumentation like percussion. I think through her work and the idea of the griot tradition, storytelling, there is something about the particularity of experience that is brought into the God Talk endeavor. And in my sort of novice experience, even in the UK, it is amazing to me how telling those stories is very disruptive, very disruptive, largely because our histories are not being discussed. It's almost like a blindsiding to engage in histories before 1999, really and truly. And so I maintain that storytelling, the griot tradition, whether through preaching, recitation, praise singing, history, conveyance, etc., that intervention humanizes and activates space in a way that is true to our oral transmission.
Yeah, and when I'm listening to Dr. Jones, especially the book Azusa Reimagined that I just wrote, I mean, part of my task is a sort of retrieval. I use the language of slave religious practices, the practices of the enslaved, but in some ways, precisely this cultural production, right? That I think Toni Morrison refers to as discredited knowledges, right? That I think that Dr. Towns also picks up on in her book, Cultural Productions of Evil. But when I think of that retrieval in Black liberation theology, and of course, you cannot say Black liberation theology or Black theological reflection without speaking of womanist theology and womanist theological reflection. I do appreciate the way in which Black theological reflection, in some ways, probably had to absorb the critiques of womanists into themselves in order to make good on the claim in terms of this retrieval of Black cultural production. But it seems to me the reason why that was so important as Black theology was emerging in the middle of the 20th century, I think this is what is so provocative about Cone and other thinkers, is that in some ways, particularly for Cone, what they are doing is they are calling out whiteness with respect to theology, with respect to our ethical reflections, with respect to our whole Christian paradigm and worldview, even what it means to be human, right? That in some ways is bound up with these particular kinds of logics. And at the center of these logics is sort of this assumption of who constitutes the subject, who constitutes the human being, and what the world looks like. And so for me, the enduring contribution of Black theological reflection is its argument that whiteness then as such was just not an effect of sort of bad theology that's done over in a corner, right? We have theology that is unbiased, that sort of is untouched from certain kinds of cultural shapings and experiences, and then the way in which people appropriate those things then sort of creates the racist ecology that we live into. But at the center of our theological and ethical understandings, like constitutive of it, is the problem of whiteness, right? Is the problem of racism. I'm just sort of thinking of Dr. J. Cameron Carter's words here that in Race, a Theological Account, that theology is then treated as cultural property of the West, right? That this is precisely what happens, and that in many ways, Black theological reflection is attempting to demonstrate this claim. I mean, I would say that people like Cone and others, they stand in the tradition of like the David Walker, the Frederick Douglass in his autobiography, the incisive critique he has at the end of that, right, of slaveholding Christianity. But it seems to me the academic discipline, what Black theological reflection was doing inside of the academy, it was the retrieval of that, but in some ways trying to then clarify systematically, right, how it is that whiteness is utterly constitutive of how we think about the theological project and therefore what it means to be human, who we understand God to be, and so forth. And I would just say this one last thought here. The reason why that is also extremely important, again, in my work for the early Pentecostal communities is because today you have neo-Pentecostalism. We know that there is a Pentecostalization of Christianity around the world. What historians are referring to, we will consider, it will be the sort of the next great Reformation. We'll write about it as such. And in some ways, neo-Pentecostalism is sort of deeply marked by this kind of white evangelical Protestantism. And there's almost a loss of memory of the kind of classical Pentecostalism that is precisely the retrieval of these kinds of traditions, of the way in which these traditions are mediating God, mediating divine activity, and the difference it makes for how we move in the world, how we morally judge, morally reason, and morally act in the world. And so for me, the enduring part, even though I don't do Black theology explicitly, it has absolutely shaped how I've thought about the tradition that I come out of and the motivating factor of my work. And I think finally that, you know, one of the enduring qualities of Black theological reflection is that it helps particularly Black scholars to wrestle with our own aspirations to whiteness within our forms of Christian faith, within our forms of theology. So you know, the question of what is the contribution? The contribution is to really think about what has been undone, right, in the process of of theology, I'll say in the West, but I like to be more specific here within the context of the United States, of American empire, and how do we begin to think and feel and sense our way out of that with this kind of retrieval that Dr. Jones is talking about.
Well, thank you. And in line with these comments, one thing that I found particularly useful about Black theological reflection and womanist thought, especially from my seat as a Bible scholar, in line with those ideas of the inherent critique of Western society that's a part of Black liberation theological perspectives, it doesn't only function in theology qua theology, but it also helps to expose the ways in which we do history, because we recognize that history is always a project of the present. That even as we look to the past, we do it through the lens of where we currently stand. And my feminist teachers helped me to understand that what we see depends on where we sit. And especially when we come to interpreting biblical texts. And part of interventions by Black liberation theology, particularly like James Cone's Crossing the Lynching Tree, is for me, as one who spends a lot of time thinking about the first centuries of the Common Era, to juxtapose the more contemporary phenomena of lynching of racialized Black people in the United States up and against the Roman processes of crucifixion and execution of low-status minoritized people is not just a project that has liberative capacity in the present, but it also opens up possibilities for historical reconstructions of the past. Because what it allows for us to consider are the ways that domination and imperial logics turn humans into criminals and creates categories that makes it excusable to execute, punish, and lock away people. And so part of what the Crossing the Lynching Tree through one of my colleagues, Shelley Matthews, has helped me to think through are the ways that when we read biblical texts, we often can easily consider how Jesus was unjustly executed, right? And we do a lot of thinking around that. But what Cone helps us to see is that by thinking about a minoritized, criminalized Black body under the thumb and oppression of empire, forces us to think historically about the conversation in Luke's Passion narrative, where one of the criminals responds, or criminalized person responds, say, we deserve this death. And what Matthews asks helpfully is, would a person, any person, say that they deserved an asphyxiating, dehumanizing death? And so part of what liberation theology helps us to consider is that while we take Jesus off the cross, there were others on crosses that need to be taken down as well, which then opens up the way that we even do the reconstruction of how we even imagine what we do on our 7 last word services for Good Friday. And so part of the line that I'm seeing in our conversation is part of this work of Black theological reflection is a retrieval of not a new history, but as the critical race theorists would call it, it's revisionist history, not in a way that's making up a history for a triumphal narrative, but it's a revisionist history and to actually tell it how it actually was. And so as we can see across the nation with the banning of critical race theory and African American studies programs, that this idea of studying the past is intimately connected with the politics of the present.
My colleagues, thank you so much for this wonderful intellectual appetizer. You're getting us ready now. So I'm going to go off script a little bit, even from the things I'd asked you I wanted to talk about, given what you just said. But it occurs to me, listening to your very insightful and beautiful opening comments, the 2 words come to mind that I would love for you each to reflect on with us. The first word, and a couple of you already mentioned it, is the word witness. And I am beholding 2 kinds of witness as you are talking, not only a certain engagement with giving witness to the peoples from which we've come, but also a certain kind of witness of what your disciplines mean in your hands. Because you are each doing something very different with your disciplines right now. And so I would love for you to reflect a bit on how you understand witness in both those sense, but also let me put the other word on the table for us to be thinking about, because you are all doing this so beautifully, and that is the word intervention. You are intervening in a number of things, and I would love to hear, I think we would all love to hear you reflect a bit more on both these ideas of witness and intervention. Any order, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and go first. I can hear both of them saying, you're the senior person. I knew that was coming. So I'm going to go ahead and go first. I'm really intrigued by both questions, but the first question of what one is witnessing to within the discipline in our hands. I'm struck that moving through a theology and ethics program as a Black woman, in particular I should qualify this as a Pentecostal Black, that's a major qualifier, right, for what I'm about to say, as a Pentecostal Black woman, is sort of this idea first that white religious figures, sources, communities have theology. Black scholars reflecting out of their own cultural communities, traditions, their resources, oftentimes, as it's described, end up having culture, right? So you have on the one side this distinction between what constitutes words about God, the truth about God, who God is, what God does, and how we are to be in the world morally. And sort of on the other side here, and again, I know it's a bit more complicated than this, but for me, I think this is a critical distinction to sort of make the point that I want to make. And on the other side, what scholars of color, and particularly Black scholars, often feel is a sense of then what we do is something less than that, right? So that then part of what we do then is between two choices. It's either trying to do what we would do in a way to where we can experience ourselves as an echo of the tradition that's conforming to whatever that tradition is, or we do it in a way that effectively sidelines us, right? That alienates, that is something culturally, again, that we're doing, not what constitutes the discipline properly. And I think that what at least I've been trying to do about early Pentecostal communities, and I agree with Swiss theologian Walter Hollenweger here, however, is that, and even David Daniels, African-American historian of Christianity, is that the greatest contribution that classical Pentecostalism, born out of the practices and the tears of previously enslaved people, or the children or grandchildren of previously enslaved people, introduced Pentecostalism at the beginning of the 20th century to the world, is that in some ways, these folks just don't contribute to the Christian faith charismata, and that is gifts. They contribute theological knowledge. They contribute a certain way of knowing about God and what God is doing in the world. And so, part of what I wanted to do, at least in my book, is to demonstrate that, right? That through their liturgical practices, through their religious rituals, through their forms of social life, that they were not only challenging the orthodoxy of the day as a kind of malformation of what the gospel was, but they were also attempting to set things right, by saying, actually, we are living into what we're supposed to be called to as an ancient Acts church, right? That we are actually attempting to embody this profound radical message of inclusivity, love, and justice. And so in that sense then, I think that it reformulates the narrative that I just mentioned at the beginning, that white theologians, scholars, they have theology, and everyone else has culture. That's not operating out of those figures, sources, and norms. But that rather, there are a variety and different ways that people are already and always experiencing God in the world, and how they are articulating that, right? Particularly as it relates to the gospel. And at least for me, this has been so important, and also for neo-Pentecostal communities to remember that history. to sort of as a form of self-correction, to remember that history, to make good on that claim when it comes to speaking about their witness in the world in light of Jesus Christ.
And if I can jump in, since you mentioned Acts,
Yes, let's talk about Acts.
one thing I think about is how the Greek word martus, behind where we get witness or martyr from, especially in Acts and in many ancient contexts, it's a reference to a legal witness. It's an activity for a court or to tell the account as it happened, knowing that the way that you report will have a material impact on someone else's life.
My goodness.
And so
Yeah.
part of this work of recovering and part of thinking about how we have a witness and our role of witness is that we have to incorporate the idea in Towns' work that is how you resist the fantastic hegemonic imagination is through counter-narrative, or counter-memory, and counter-memory is to tell the truth. The way that the story gets straightened is by telling what actually happened, to actually, from the biblical studies perspective, to open up different possibilities for reading these texts, to see communities that would have resisted different forms of oppression and domination, to recognize that there are multiple possibilities for interpreting, that there were communities that were not just in alignment with some of the most violent and toxic heritages that we witness now, but to do that work of uncovering and to say that even if it's a minority witness, there's a witness in antiquity that we can align with, that was a part of movements for justice, liberation, and wholeness.
That's good. That's good.
They say that an excellent musician knows how to deal with silence. If they don't know how to deal with silence, then they don't know how to deal with noise. And when I hear the word witness, and as our co-panelists talk about it, I think of the silences. I think of inaudibility, which is really what I'm getting at with anti-oppressive listening. And one of our seminarians also pointed out that work started in my first book where I talk about unspokenness. And I wanted to continue that project largely because in Black sacred music, there's this imagination that all we do is sing loud. So I wanted to address that. So silences. And in this idea of anti-oppressive listening, I want to witness and make audible those communities that visually are invisibilized. I seek to bring into the room or ask to come forward my mother, a person who would be considered a non-traditional student, but who launched businesses and churches. There is a wisdom there. There is an experience, and there's also some weathered storms. I want to call forth into the room also people who are the stalwarts in our community, the church mother who will let you know how you're doing when you're preaching, right? You will know how you're doing.
Right away.
And I also want to bring into the room those voices that have been dubbed the Black insane. Those who are disregarded because they have experienced some sort of mental break. I'm thinking today of Margaret Holloway. Does anyone know this name, Margaret Holloway? Do we know the Shakespeare lady?
Oh, Margaret.
The Shakespeare lady. Anybody remember the Shakespeare lady?
Yes.
I've been thinking about the Shakespeare lady as I've been conceptualizing genius.
Wow.
Because Margaret Holloway was actually a religious studies scholar.
Wow.
Yes.
She was a celebrated religious studies scholar who was courted from Minnesota to Bennington College and then came here to Yale for her MFA. And while she was here in New Haven, this woman that many of us would recall we would see her perhaps, at night, and she would recite iambic pentameter, Hamlet, and she activated space. And there were moments people would offer her money, and she was like, I don't need your money, just let me give you a verse. And then she gave a verse. Now, for us, we might think of this transactional relationship, but if I understand the griot tradition and know my history and understand anti-oppressive ways of listening, I hear and see her in within a lineage of women who, on the market, were actually appraised by how many verses they knew. Rhiannon Giddens has a song, 10,000 Verses. Literally, there were women who throughout the transatlantic slave trade commanded money because of how much verses they knew on the auction block. And so when I hear her and I think of her, she passed as a result of COVID. I'm also humbled because I now realize through reading her obituaries and looking at the documentaries about her life that she lived with schizophrenia that was activated through sexual assault.
That's right.
And I do offer a trigger warning here because there was particularly charged religious language to describe her condition by researchers. They described her as living with a tactile demon because throughout the day, and again I want to say that this is a trigger warning, throughout the day, she would experience the violation. And what we were seeing was her working out that experience and distancing from that perpetual experience, that tactile demon. And I wonder, though, if there were a womanist chaplain when she was being assessed by UCLA, could that womanist chaplain have given different language for her affliction? I say this as a granddaughter of a woman who was a Black insane. And every time I have the opportunity to love God with my mind, it is my prayer of thanksgiving for Marie Jones,
My goodness.
who went ahead and had her children despite being institutionalized. And so when we do these verses and recitations and do our storytelling, whose voices are we really conjuring and bringing forth? And whose giftedness are we listening for? Because I don't know that we provided community for Mother Holloway. I don't know that we did. And I don't even know that I knew she was a sister in the alumna sense. I don't think I knew that. And I felt a repentance for that. And so witness in terms of audibility, whose voices we take seriously. She was award-winning, was in the classroom with folks who are multi-Oscar winners. And she actually, in her master's thesis, and I wrote it down, her 1980 master's thesis, which I hope someone looks at closely, it was entitled God's Smoke, a Thesis Production. And in it, she theorizes a theater of hunger in which schizophrenia is a means of survival.
Oh my gosh, wow.
Incredible. Thank you so much. So, dear friends, you were eloquent about the witness side of that question. I wonder if you want to offer some more thoughts in terms of intervention.
Well, I can jump in on the intervention aspect. And part of what I was digging at before is that part of what I see my intervention as is in line with reimagining and reconstructing how we think of Christian origins and early history, but not as a way to just legitimize current systems and orders, but to actually imagine otherwise in other ways that existed. And part of this is both through Black liberation and women's theologies, but also as we think about African American interpretation, both within academic spaces, but outside of it, that actually can help us to engage how these texts would have even been understood in the first audiences. For example, in the Deutero-Pauline letters, when we see slaves obey your masters, we can imagine that enslaved people hearing that would not have said amen. and thinking about that passage through the lens of enslaved people in the Americas, Clarice Martin shares a story of a preacher preaching to enslaved people on a plantation, and he took as his text the book of Philemon, and some of the listeners resisted openly, some got up, and these are enslaved people, and said, there's no such book in the Bible. And part of what that moment demonstrates to me is that within many strands of African American biblical interpretation, there has been always this tendency, maybe even innate and inherent, to recognize that just because something is in the Bible does not mean that it's a word from God. It's the work of constantly negotiating and reconsidering scriptural authority. And that aspect is important, especially for congregations that still use biblical text as weapons to harm rather than as tools to heal. And so part of what the intervention is from my work is to how do we take these biblical texts, and then how do we think about them not only as tools to heal, but how can we follow traditions and trajectories that help us to see and otherwise that might have even been in a minority in antiquity, but we can, through a lens of like those enslaved people that resisted hearing the book of Philemon from that enslaver's lens, they were able to see another way with these texts, a way that was a way toward liberation. Why they were able to not discard the entire Bible because Philemon was in those Hostafel or household codes, but they were able to say, well, I may not agree with that image, and I may not hear God's voice there, but over in Exodus. And that is actually critical biblical interpretation. That is sophisticated hermeneutics and exegesis. It's not just allowing one to, find a passage that is convenient, but is actually doing the difficult work of saying, how do these ancient texts make meaning today? For whom and with what effect?
Yes.
Wow.
And I would say that I've talked a bit about my own work coming out of the Pentecostal tradition. Even what you're talking about right now in terms of the kind of critical biblical interpretation that sort of gives way to an otherwise world, otherwise possibilities, is, at least for me, then thinking about what it means to talk about, say within Christian theology especially, within Christian ethical reflection, spirit as first word, right? It's part of what probably I should note is it's not simply that the Azusa community or classical Pentecostalism, for example, is the only Black community reflecting on the importance and the centrality of the Spirit and what they come to understand about God. This is a different kind of epistemology, right? This is a different kind of leaning into how we think, how we come to know what we know about God and God's activity in the world. But what they're doing is they're sort of witnessing to and drawing into their present at that time the religious practices and rituals that were on the enslaved plantation economies, right? In the hush harbors, in the praise houses, the PRAY''S houses. We hear about the Black men who were the preachers, but we rarely talk about many historians like Alonzo Smith. They've written about this extensively. The praise houses, where these were the places where people would go and experience conversion. But the praise houses, the women, the Black women were the gatekeepers of the praise houses. And actually one could not even get admittance into certain churches unless they had had an experience in the praise house. And so for me, it is about the way in which they are valuing that, prioritizing that, pulling that forward and saying, you know, before we actually experience what we would experience by way of colonized Christianity, we knew God. We knew God. And it was sort of the retrieval, the reclamation of those kind of practices. For me, part of my intervention then is thinking about the Spirit as first word. What difference does that make then in how we think about everything from the doctrine of God to Christology? How does that allow us to think about what it means when we speak about being the body of Christ? But thinking about that in a more expansive and emancipatory way than the way that we're doing it right now, right? Where it feels oftentimes closed off, radically exclusive, because we're operating in all kinds of dichotomies and binaries and so forth. And so for me, this is the critical intervention, is how do we think about the Spirit as the first word? And then I'll just say this, and I know Dr. Jones may have something to say about intervention. Right now, I'm working on a constructive theology of spirit that sort of comes out of my book, Azusa Reimagined. And I've been thinking a lot about the encounter of divine irresistibility that is present at Azusa, the way in which, in and through their flesh, in and through the body, there is a mediation of divine presence. And that this experience is about the experience of an irresistible God, a God that pulls and draws and lures one in. And it's in that moment that one truly experiences oneself as the beloved of God, who they've always been. But that's radically defiant and subversive within a societal context that sees you as unworthy, as unvalued, as subhuman, and so forth. And for me, it's sort of the question in terms of talking about divine irresistibility, what kind of epistemic significance does this have? You know, how does this then help us to think about other ways of knowing other than the discursive ways we often come to think about, right? Knowing God, right? Through propositions, through philosophical argumentation, through ontological statements about God. What would it mean to think about God in this way that we see down at Azusa, in this, I would say, profoundly effective way? And we know the whole history within Christian theology of subordinating the mind to the body, right? And a contemplation to the base passions and so forth. But what will it yield by thinking of God through this encounter with a kind of divine irresistibility? Because I would argue that's what you see in many of the enslaved religious practices. What is being mediated is this experience of a divine encounter that is simply irresistible, that draws them in to a loving embrace. And in and through that encounter, it transforms their relationships, how they view the world, what they are called to ethically in terms of love, justice, and belonging. And so for me, that's the critical intervention, right? Is thinking about spirit as first word.
I'm excited. I need to shout you out, particularly as my Pentecostal sister. Largely in this space, right? Yale Divinity School, where Pentecostalism, you know, is often, there's a little chuckle sometimes with us demonstrative folks. So it was always cool to walk these halls and hear of your witness going before. Intervention. I feel like when you said that, I felt like I was being punked because I'm always asking, what's your intervention? I was like, can someone slide a note to Reverend Dr. Jennings? I think the intervention for me is I follow the tensions. I can see Carolyn Sharp somewhere, like, you know, remain in the complexity. I can see that gesture that she would do in Bible class, in the Hebrew Bible class. But the tensions, man, whether it's like pushback in a Q&A or, you know, sparring, or if I'm lecturing in a church and a deacon or elder just scrunches their face, I actually might take a moment and do some breathing exercises, but then I tailor something about what I'm doing to bring them into the conversation. And that's where I find my gold. where people get activated in certain ways in the classroom. I write it down, and then I pray about it. I do pray about it. And then I wait for the driftwood to help me interweave their question into the answer to that question into what I'm working on. In addition to looking at the tensions, my intervention is also to demonstrate the value of everydayness. And by everydayness, I want us to, in the same way my colleagues have mentioned, I want us to know that our folks have had repertoires since, you know, and perhaps this is the anthropological debate that we've been concerned with in music and culture, this idea of cultural retention, whether or not we kept with us our culture, keeping a continuity before the transatlantic slave trade. And I say an emphatic yes. There are folks who still want to debate this. I don't have time for that. I believe in living epistles through and through, in my African Americanness and my Christianity, living epistles. And that's probably why the griot tradition really resonates with me. That said, there's a formula I'd like to give you when thinking about aesthetics of African American music, and that is dance, drum, song. Dance, drum, song as core attributes that we see negotiated within African American music making. And I'm giving this to you because it's been in our religiosity that dance, drum, and song have been censored. It was the drum that was one of the instruments that was prohibited by law for us to play. And as a result, it has trickled into our religious practice. To this day, there are churches that do not play drums in African American worship because it was constructed as demonic. But we also know that one of the reasons why it was prohibited was because people heard talk of talking drums, and a cachet of talking instrumentation. But the drums were played in a way that mimicked speech. We also know dance was surveilled and censored. This is why we have things like the ring shout, counterclockwise movements that were practiced in the praise houses under white surveillance. A white person had to be there. And should the person cross their feet or move too much, that could be something that would be punished through vigilantes or through law enforcement. But then song, and when I think of song and everydayness as a part of my intervention, there's a story that I tell folks because I want to see a movement in response to this story. And I get it from Albert J. Roberto. You know, it's those little fleeting stories that we get. I often think of that story in response to what is the sound of social justice today? And my response is, it's right here with us. He writes of a story where there is this person who is in a garden, and as they are in this garden, they come up to a group of people, and this group of people are surrounding a grave, and they are singing. They are singing, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, and Z. And these people were singing the song to their teacher, who had taught them their ABCs despite prohibitions around reading and writing. And to sing that song could have been punishable by death.
My goodness.
What if we began our services with the ABCs? in the same way they did as a prayer of thanksgiving for their teacher who risked their life in order to pass the tradition along. So when we're talking about social justice, we're talking about the everydayness of the rudiments, the rudiments. What if our children's choir sang the ABCs with that knowledge? Like, will you teach your little one that? You know what I'm saying? That understanding. But then it's also a call to me as an educator who often gets overlooked in this utterance of fivefold ministry in our churches. It reminds me of the cost and the everydayness of getting folks to do their ABCs. Yeah.
My goodness, how rich, dear friends. So I know as I look at this wonderful audience, I can see that they're chomping at the bit to offer a few thoughts and questions, but I'm going to make them wait because there's another question that I would be remiss if I didn't ask you all to reflect on. And as you know, there are so many pressing concerns in theological education, but especially in Black theological reflection. And I would love for you to share with us one pressing concern that you see that is occupying our time and should occupy our time as we move into the future of Black theology and Black theological reflection.
Well, one thing that I think is extremely important that should occupy our time, a little bit in line with a previous comment I made, and in thinking about the ordinariness of resistance, is the way that we engage biblical texts and the way that we are deliberate about our interpretations, recognizing that we're all guilty of an interpretation and we must take account of what we're guilty of. And in Black theological spaces, where, as I mentioned before, so often we've used these texts to harm people, to keep women out of leadership, to exclude LGBTQIA+ persons, it's important that we recognize, first of all, that those are misuses of the Bible, and that's not practicing safe texts. But actually, we have to continue to wrestle with this text, recognizing that it has this value in the public square, but also in Black life. And so continuing to actually do deep dives and to wrestle with texts and not just assume that meanings are obvious, that they, because we have heard them repeated over and over, but to recognize that sitting in the complexity of these ancient texts, we often recognize that the Bible leaves you with many more questions than answers.
Yes.
And learning to lean into the question, which, depending on how we think about Blackness itself, especially as constructed in Western European philosophical and even theological discourse, it's always a question mark. And part of leaning into that question is recognizing the lie that was the certainty. And part of this work is in asking questions even about a text as sacred as the Bible.
Yeah.
And to say, if this is questionable, then what else about our society, our existence, the way that we speak, the discourses that we inhabit, what else is questionable? And I do have an answer for that. Everything.
I've done a lot of work on neoliberalism, right? Neoliberalism not only as a sort of economic arrangement, a set of economic arrangements, but sort of as a normative rationality, right? The way in which it sort of colonizes all of the moral life. so that market values become the norms and the values that we then live by. And I think that first, theological institutions, before I go to sort of the people that, the faculty, the students, and others that make up these institutions, and how we might think about the producing of leaders moving into the world is, Black theological reflection offers a way to really wrestle critically with the increased corporatization of not just the university, but of theological education, where within theological education, there is a tendency to operate according to this normative rationality, right? Where, for example, I can speak as a faculty member, where your work often, at least you're unable at times to treat your work as an extension of who you are, an expression of your vocation and call, but rather a product that gives you lifetime security, right? As just one example. And so it seems to me that first on an institutional level, in terms of theological education, there needs to be first a kind of repentance of the values that we have held dear in terms of neoliberal rationality. But then also, I think that what Black theological and womanist reflection offers is, who do we listen to in order to make that turn? Who are the voices? I mean, this is why I appreciate so much of what my colleagues have said, is who are the voices that we then turn to hear and to gain wisdom and prudence on what needs to be done, right? And I think this is the best of what Black liberation reflection, womanist, and really African American theology, broadly speaking, has offered, is to turn to those who often are not seen as having much to say, but who in many ways are bearing the brunt of the effects of what's going on. And so, for me, it's listening to the margins, listening to those that have been discredited in order to think about a new moment. And to me, it's an exercise of moral imagination, because many feel like very fatalistic, like there's no way to get out of this kind of ecology that we're in.
Right.
And I think in doing that, I think that what we will be more poised to do is to ask a new set of questions. To your point, it's not always about the answer as much as asking better questions, right? Is to be able to ask a new set of questions, and we can think together with those that are coming into our classrooms, those coming into our institutions. And then I'll even say this, and then as a theological institutions, maybe we will see that theological education is just not going on in here, but it's going on at other sites, in other communities, so that becoming outward facing and collaborating not only will lead to them knowing more about our expertise, but ultimately will lead to a transformation of who we are in our very life and how we come to understand what God is doing.
Wow. I think we should turn our attention to intellectual property. You'll recall I mentioned that we were appraised by the verses that we knew. And as folks whose culture is comprised of a lot of music, it's a part of our everyday life. It is how we get things done. Oral transmission is often tapped into in ways that have been exploitative in the academy in particular. For example, research shows that at least among African Americans, service, volunteering, giving back, that is a huge part of what we feel our leaning and gravitation toward, our inclination toward, but then also the pedagogical skills that resemble the charisma that is cultivated within the Academy of the Black Church. And for these reasons, we get erased from intellectual histories. And so sonic movements like Cite Black Women, hashtag Cite Black Women, I think are so crucial if we pay attention, because citation and us being really clear about citational practices and erasure that occurs when we're not vigilant about citational practices could really be a part of our liberation as scholars. So many of our colleagues who are in situations that they have large teaching loads because of the sorts of institutions that they are serving. They need us to amplify their voices by saying their names, speaking their presentations that they have put together, the lectures that they have given, often because in this Eurocentric mode of assessment, publish or perish, it actually discounts the oral transmission that we take seriously. As I was thinking about tonight, I thought about the womanist move you made early on in your research life, publishing a book. I think it was self-published, a book that you did.
That's right.
Yes,
Seeds of Greatness.
yes.
Forgot about that.
I remember that.
I was young.
I remember that. And of course, you know, in the hush harbors, we talk about these sorts of projects. But I, and those who can't stand it, you can cover your ears, but I encourage people to do that. Because when we think about things like royalties, we know how academic royalties work, okay? When we think of how much we give away and how much we historically have given away, let me just say this here because people don't know this, but copyright for African Americans is a 20th century affordance.
Yep.
We were not permitted to copyright our property. We were not permitted to trademark or patent well into the 20th century. And so to me, I'm at a point now where even though people diminish self-publishing, as a person who has commanded the numbers, I'm going to start owning my stuff. Wow. Intellectual property. Because I know you're doing the math. The math isn't mathy for many of us. And I know people are telling us about our dossier, but what is tenure these days anyway, if we really talk about it? But I didn't say it. You didn't hear it from me. That's a silence.
Says the tenured professor.
Listen, that's a silence. But all that to say, I think, who makes the rules?
Yeah, it's good. It's good.
Who makes the rules? Many of us are sought after for our ability to command rooms, and we have nothing in our posterity. I'm so concerned about our wealth retention. And for us historically, it has been our verses. So who owns your verses? Who owns your verses?
That's good.
That's fantastic. It's fantastic. So, friends, we have just a couple of minutes for questions. As you can be upset with me if I've taken most of the time from the audience. I'm not apologizing. So we have a time for one, maybe two questions. So please stand up, tell us who you are, where you're from, and remember the 4 B's, my friend. Be brief, my friend. Be brief. 4 B's. So please.
I'll be brief. My name is Sarah Menard. I'm a 4th-year MDiv student. And as I'm making my way out of here, I am sensing the experience of theological education as survivor's guilt. As a Caribbean woman, a descent of immigrant parents from Haiti, having this opportunity to come here. Now, there was no YDS admissions representative who found me. The Spirit led me here. But I think about how many of the young people in my congregation who won't make it to theological institution because admissions aren't in our community. Thank you, Dr. Carrie Day, for speaking about outward facing. Can you just speak a little bit about the structure of gatekeeping, of who gets here? Because we're here, but if we're thinking about and talking about theological education in the future, what about others who can't get here, who won't get here because we built walls to determine who will come through here?
Was this for the panel or for me?
Well,
Oh, okay.
she's your name.
Okay. I mean, that's a really difficult question, right? And talk. I mean, because in some ways, the unfortunate answer is sitting in the question, in terms of the structure of gatekeeping. I mean, a part of it seems to me. So I think there are 2 ways historically it's been approached in terms of the problem of gatekeeping. It's been we just simply need more bodies of color in leadership, and. And if we have more bodies of color in leadership, at some point it will open the way to a more inclusive, more equitable environment, right? So that precisely what you're talking about, those that ordinarily wouldn't have access, they would be able to have access in a variety of ways. I mean, right now, the biggest thing that universities across the board, Harvard, Stanford, others, and it's trickling down to theological education schools, is the future of theological education with respect to hybrid and online, right? The virtual reality. So I mean, so that's there, this question of access. So that's been the first historical response. Well, there's some on the other side, and I mean, there are probably a range of, this is a range, right? There are a number of responses in between the two options that I'm giving. Then there's this other response that says, that would say, well, you know, you can have bodies of color in the room, but this has nothing to do with the kind of sustainable perspectives that are truly oriented towards justice, towards questions of equity and belonging, right? And so it seems to me, given that, and I would happen to probably be in the second group, given that, it seems to me that there has to be not only a shift and a transformation in the material resources, which is what you're getting at, but there has to be a shift and a transformation in the cultural paradigm, in the worldview, right? People are walking into the room with particular assumptions about why, for example, theological institutions should categorically not be accessible in these kinds of ways. And much of it, again, is built on this very neoliberal understanding of, say, the university or the institution as offering expertise, as being elitist in a particular kind of way, right? So that what it means to be me in an elite institution can only be that way, distinguished over and against, say, the ignorant masses or those that do not have the kind of expertise that I have, the lay people. And so there has to be a shift in literally the cultural worldview. And I guess part of what we've been suggesting up here is that that is not even possible. There's a prior conversation that needs to happen. And the prior conversation has everything to do with those folks that have been left out. Those folks that bring a rich history of cultural narratives and resources to this question on how we think our way into better worlds, more accessible worlds for folks that truly need it.
Thank you so much.
I want to add to particularly how you self-identified with Caribbean heritage. I think, and I'll just speak from my experience, but I'm sure others have noticed, that there needs to be more language, imagination, exposure around Black internationalism. I've sat at tables advocating for applicants and students where, for example, Black male reads very proficient in African American culture, but from Aruba. And put up for an African American opportunity, folks are like gobsmacked that this is not an African American applicant, this is a multilingual Aruban. And I would say every time I spoke of this person, multilingual Aruban, because there were ways that, and many of us are guilty of this, people would remark on things like writing. And it wasn't taken into consideration with other folks who phenotypically read as international. And so a part of what I had to find myself doing was giving people the verbiage to understand this sort of global Blackness, this international Blackness. And it's translating now, even in the UK, as an African American who is multilingual in comparison to monolinguistic Great British people or British people, to then engage the students on this international stage. I see the sideways looks like, so we're doing, yes, we are doing this. We are doing this. And so I encourage you to teach us when you feel like it. Not take on the labor, but I think teaching, empowering our students and our communities to understand it's a co-learning as well, in the sense that we need to know what characterizes your living epistleship. You know, what is it about what you bring as a gift to the body of Christ, if that is your faith tradition, or to your faith community, or your humanistic community. What is it that your gifting does that is the difference? I'll tell you, I'm the better for it if you are able. If you are able. If you're not able, oh, for your health, keep it to yourself. Please, for your health, keep it to yourself. And for those of us who have the great joy of engaging you as teachers, I hope we listen. I hope we get that opportunity to listen.
And if I could just accent one of those points, especially underlining the if you're able to teach. But one aspect, and not just for you, but for anybody in the room, I think sometimes we underestimate how much we already know. And I believe in the ordinariness of the ABC's example, that having been exposed to this place with the resources and the courses, and traditionally, right, this training is for people to go in ministry historically. But in this digital world where one can have a congregation that they never actually see, but it's an Instagram Live or a Zoom meeting or a course that's pre-recorded and people can watch all over the place, to imagine how we can disseminate this information, especially for liberation and otherwise, but to consider that part of the exchange for many of us coming from our communities here is not just so that we can, as Dr. Day mentioned, lord this over the people that sent us here, but to actually have something to offer back to the people who've invested in us with prayers or expectations or hope even. And navigating what that looks like is always going to be a challenge. But there is something you know now. There's a lot of things that you know now that you can explain to somebody who doesn't know what you know. And sometimes because we are in spaces like this and we're surrounded by such brilliant scholars as these panelists, that we might feel like we don't have enough or they need to come where we've come. But you've been around, you've imbibed in some great waters that people are looking for you to be a reserve. But again, if you're able, if you're able.
Friends, would you join me in thanking our panel?